Israel says it has hit Hezbollah's central headquarters in an attack on a densely populated Beirut neighbourhood. Israeli media are reporting that the target was Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. It's the biggest Israeli attack on Beirut since the 2006 war in Lebanon, and Iran's embassy there has warned that the strike is an escalation that changes the rules of the game. Hezbollah is backed by Iran and has been firing rockets into Israel since the October 7 terrorist attack by its ally Hamas. Earlier this month, Israel shifted the focus of its military operations from Gaza to Lebanon.
The explosions were felt as far as 30 kilometres away. Multiple buildings were levelled in this residential suburb of southern Beirut. Israel's army quickly confirmed it was behind the strike.
Moments ago, the Israel Defense Forces carried out a precise strike on the central headquarters of the Hezbollah terror organization that served as the epicenter of Hezbollah's terror. Hezbollah's central headquarters was intentionally built under residential buildings in the heart of the Dahia in Beirut.
The Israel Defense Forces released this footage showing Defense Minister Yoav Gallant monitoring the strikes on Beirut from Tel Aviv. Israeli media sources quoting officials say this man was the target, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. The strike came a day after Israel rejected a 21-day truce plan proposed by the United States and its allies, designed to prevent an all-out war in the Middle East. It's feared further escalation could prompt Hezbollah's backer Iran to enter the conflict. Israel and Hezbollah have been exchanging fire across the Israel-Lebanon border for over 11 months since the October 7th terror attacks on Israel by Hezbollah's Palestinian ally Hamas. Both are considered terrorist groups by multiple countries. But this week Israel dramatically intensified its strikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, killing 700 people according to Lebanese officials, and prompting more than 100,000 civilians to flee. On Friday, Iran's embassy in Lebanon vowed punishment for Israel, saying the strike, quote, changes the rules of the game. And that's just what international observers fear. With Israel reported to have moved thousands of troops towards the border in preparation for a potential ground invasion, the prospects of a wider war seem higher than ever.
Let's go to Jerusalem now, and DW correspondent Tania Krämer. Tania, we've seen that there have been other explosions across Beirut. What are the latest developments?
Well, yeah, shortly after 11 o'clock here local time, the Israeli military had published a map of the southern suburbs of, or southern part of Beirut, and they basically were telling people in those neighborhoods to leave the area. And ever since, we've seen waves of airstrikes in this area. The Israeli military had said it had struck dozens of targets, weapons stored beneath civilian buildings, as they put it. They also has carried out strikes in southern Lebanon over the past hours or so. We had some rocket alerts from incoming rocket fire from Lebanon towards northern towns. Now, what we are seeing tonight here is much larger strikes now on Beirut, taking out basically, as we understand it, infrastructure. Until now, we've seen targeted strikes against Hezbollah commanders there, and also what happened, of course, earlier tonight. But now this seems to intensify the conflict with targeting also the infrastructure of Hezbollah in southern Beirut.
As you said, Tania, that first major strike appeared to be targeting Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. Can we say if he is dead or alive?
We don't know yet. There are a lot of speculations, a lot of reports out, also denials that he is healthy and alive. But here in Israel, there have been a lot of reports based on senior officials or also on intelligence sources. They said this strike on this scale would have only happened if the intelligence here was enough to say that at least Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was in the area, was in this underground headquarters. Now we heard it earlier there from the shortly after the strike happened in Beirut. Only this official statement by the army spokesperson Daniel Hagari saying that the IDF or the military had carried out a strike on the central headquarters. Ever since, there is not yet a confirmation whether Hassan Nasrallah was indeed targeted, was indeed there at the location. So everybody's waiting to hear more. But what we've been seeing, these were massive strikes on this underground structure. Also, of course, with more and more civilian also casualties expected in the area. And of course, we also heard that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he was at the United Nations giving his speech there. And this happened shortly after. And his office said that he would cut short his visit and come back to Israel earlier than planned.
You've mentioned that many of these strikes are hitting residential buildings, ostensibly. Many of our viewers are probably wondering how targeted such attacks can be. What does the Israeli military say about these strikes and the toll that they're taking on civilians?
Well, they always say, basically, and they said that again tonight when they carried out this large strike earlier this evening, that they're targeting Hezbollah commanders or infrastructure in this case later tonight now. And that actually Hezbollah is placing those, their headquarters or weapon storage in civilian homes. This is what the military here says, and this is why they're striking those houses or homes or areas. They have said this also, you've seen this also in Gaza, in the war there, striking those areas and always saying that basically Hezbollah is using the civilian population there as human shields. But of course it comes at a cost. And I think we only see now the casualty numbers coming in over the course of the evening. And also now, of course, from these latest strikes, of course, Israel would say we have been warning people that these strikes are coming. But of course, it's one of the most densely populated areas there, the southern suburb of Beirut. So we're expecting the death toll and the injuries coming from there to rise significantly.
Tania Krämer in Jerusalem, thank you.
The Beirut bombing happened shortly after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the UN General Assembly, where he vowed to keep fighting Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran.
As long as Hezbollah chooses the path of war, Israel has no choice, and Israel has every right to remove this threat and return our citizens to their homes safely. And that's exactly what we're doing. And we'll continue degrading Hezbollah until all our objectives are met.
Let's pick up some of Mr. Netanyahu's points with Daniel Levy, who's president of the US Middle East Project. He's a former Israeli diplomat who helped negotiate the Oslo Peace Accords. Welcome back to DW. Can we start? We'll get to Mr. Netanyahu shortly. Can we start first with your thoughts on the IDF's attack on what they described as the epicenter of Hezbollah's terror in Beirut?
Yeah, I think the copy-pasting of words like terror aren't very helpful here. Clearly, there are things that the Axis of Resistance forces have done that have violated international law. Clearly, Israel is violating international law every day. If they're terrorist groups, then Israel is a terrorist state. So I would encourage desisting from the use of that language. In terms of the action itself, clearly this has been a major strike on a civilian neighborhood in Beirut. We will see what the extent of the damage is. We will see who has been killed in this strike. What we've seen, Phil, in the last 2 weeks, I think, is the degrading, and clearly there's been an intel success by Israel and an infiltration of Hezbollah and the degrading of Hezbollah capacity, something, in fact, that Israel failed to achieve with almost a year against Hamas in Gaza. I think we should distinguish between degrading that capacity and incapacitating a movement. So I think that there is still a dangerous, very dangerous escalatory path that we are on. And the thing that we're seeing tonight is the Israeli military calling on neighborhoods in Beirut to be evacuated. That's what we saw in Gaza. I hope we don't now see a copy of the wanton destruction that happened in 2006 by Israel in Lebanon, and that has happened for the last year to an ever greater extent. Plausible violations of the Genocide Convention have been committed by Israel. Are we going to see these in Lebanon now? And I fear that what we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu in New York in the General Assembly today was very dangerous in many respects, but there was one sentence that stood out for me, Phil. He said about Lebanon that there is a missile in every kitchen, a rocket in every garage. Now, that is clearly not true, but what it is an invitation to hit every kitchen and every home. That is disproportionate. That's the targeting of civilians.
We have seen, however, or the allegation is that Hezbollah, like Hamas, consistently put themselves in civilian infrastructure in order to protect themselves. So if a country like Israel is fighting a war with these groups, how does it take them out without without injuring civilians?
Well, let's unpack what you've just said, and I'm disturbed by the question. I'm going to be honest with you, Phil. I used to work and serve in the Israeli military. The office I served in was very much in the center of Tel Aviv. Does that make Tel Aviv a legitimate target? Now, are you seriously considering the notion that 40,000 plus dead Palestinians, the vast majority of them civilians, overwhelmingly women and children, and civilian men, by the way, that is acceptable? That is the reason that the International Court of Justice has called for urgent provisional measures. The refusal to allow humanitarian aid.
And just to be clear, nobody, you or I, in this discussion has described what you have said there as acceptable, right? So just so we're clear.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
How does this latest escalation between Israel and Hezbollah not end in all-out war? Israel says it wants to clear Hezbollah from its northern border and return its people. Hezbollah says it will keep attacking Israel until there's a ceasefire in Gaza, which neither side is signing up to.
Which neither side? I'm sorry, Israel is rejecting a ceasefire in Gaza. Yes. Hamas's position has been very consistent. Hamas's position has been, if there is a full ceasefire, we accept it. The Americans know that. The mediators from Qatar and Egypt know that. The Israeli defense establishment know that. The hostage families know that. The protesters in Israel know that. It is Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition that don't know that. And I'm afraid they are acting in a rogue manner, whether it's in Gaza or it's elsewhere. They're able to act in a rogue manner because the United States and other Western allies in Europe, Germany and others, are continuing to provide political and diplomatic cover, and in the case of the United States, the weapons and positioning their warships and getting directly involved to enable this to happen. It is reasonable to have a comprehensive ceasefire. I fear that this latest escalation in Lebanon will not lead to a ceasefire. What you will have is a Hezbollah capacity, and other actors are likely to join in. The Houthis are already involved. Iraqi militias are already involved. As long as they continue to send missiles into Israel, Israel will walk itself, as it has done elsewhere, up the escalatory ladder. That is likely to lead to a ground operation if this continues. Then the dynamic will switch, because wars of attrition are not where Israel does well. And then you are going to see Israel more in a corner. And let's remember that a country with an extremist leadership is also a nuclear power. That's how dangerous this is. One would expect the country that has leverage with Israel to step in, and it has failed to step in.
But clearly, it hasn't happened. It has tried to. We've seen the Biden administration cautioning and Israel ignoring. But I just want to take a step back.
You can't caution. You can't caution and provide weapons at the same time, can you?
Understood.
So the Americans, Wednesday evening, the Americans brief the press. It's up on the White House website. I'm sure you've seen it, Phil. They give this background briefing and they say, this is a breakthrough. We've reached this moment. We're waiting for the parties to announce this 21-day pause in Beirut. Apparently, Netanyahu was either leading them on a merry dance or he got cold feet. Israel announces that it's not going along with this. And rather than call that out, rather than say there'll be a consequence, the same day the Israeli Defense Ministry is thanking the Americans for billions more in military assistance. So the Americans are not trying. Either they want to see this destruction or they are embarrassingly amateurish and politically constrained. I think it's well time that others stepped in. Yeah, sorry, Phil.
OK, let's turn to Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the General Assembly. We'll play a clip and then get your thoughts.
I have a message for the tyrants of Tehran. If you strike us, we will strike you. There is no place. There is no place in Iran that the long arm of Israel cannot reach. And that's true of the entire Middle East.
Daniel Levy, who do you think this speech today from the Israeli Prime Minister was aimed at?
It's a really interesting question. And I was asking myself that a lot when I was watching the speech, Phil. It was clearly for a domestic audience, which is understandable. When most leaders go to New York, they want to broadcast a message back home. This is at a moment, obviously, when Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to revive his political fortunes. You know, he has faced a political crisis. He's keeping his coalition together. So that's one audience. I feel that the rest of the audience was America and a tiny bit other Western allies. I don't think he was talking to the rest of the world. He was talking a language of 19th century racist colonialism when he speaks about barbarians and civilians, as if the country that has destroyed Gaza, that the person who has an arrest warrant request against him for using starvation as a weapon of war, a war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, as if he is speaking on behalf of the civilized nations. He uses a language that many people may still think in those terms, but they don't use that.
Correct the record there. Not a war criminal. There is talk about a potential for an arrest warrant, but let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Well, there is a request. There is a request from the judges for an arrest warrant by the chief prosecutor. The arrest warrant has not yet been issued. I personally would call it
not a war criminal. Let's just be clear about that.
Not a proven war criminal, a man with a request for an arrest warrant by the chief prosecutor of the ICC. It's not a small thing.
Right. Which brings us to my final question, really. How do you see Benjamin Netanyahu's future? He's embroiled in two wars, possibly a wider conflict with Iran, and, as you say, a looming arrest warrant from the ICC that could make him persona non grata, like Vladimir Putin. Look,
Phil, I think it's only fair to share this. This is helping him in the opinion polls. He's actually got a bit of a boost back home in Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in addition to all the things we've been discussing, faces a domestic court case, nothing to do with the International Criminal Court, nothing to do with Palestinians or Lebanese people, over his own potential corruption and violations of Israeli law. So he's very literal get out of jail card is staying in power, staying as leader. And here you have the convergence of a personal interest, which I just described, of a political interest, which is that he's trying to say, I'm the indispensable wartime leader. To be a wartime leader, you need war. This is how he's rebuilding himself politically. And thirdly, it converges with the ideology that Netanyahu and his coalition genuinely want to This is the stated claim of the coalition partners to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. The government guidelines signed off on, led by Netanyahu, are that Jews have an exclusive right to all of the land of Israel. So this convergence means that we are likely to see yet more of what has happened over the last period, which should send a shudder through everyone. There was one other thing worth picking up on, I think, from that speech. He talked about the curse and the blessing. And in that respect, I think Netanyahu was also, you asked me about the audiences, I do think he was talking to that dispensationalist Christian evangelical community in the US, who are probably the most important backers, more so than the Jewish community, which is quite divided on this, who are Israel's most important backers in the US and in particular in Donald Trump's Republican Party.
Well, much to think about there, and we thank you for it. Daniel Levy from the US Middle East Project. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at this with Simon Mabon. He's a Middle East expert who lectures in international relations at Lancaster University in the UK. Welcome back to DW, Simon. What did you make of Benjamin Netanyahu's speech?
Well, I think anyone who's been listening to Mr. Netanyahu over the past few years would have pretty much expected what he said. It was full of bombast, it was full of rhetoric, it was full of really strong, powerful, symbolic language, but it wasn't anything new. It was strong on Hezbollah, it continued this line that he's been using for the past year on Hamas, and it continued the line that he's been using for the past 2 or 3 decades on Iran, which is to say Iran is a nefarious, malevolent presence across the Middle East, and it must be stopped. And so in that respect, what we saw today, what we heard today, was nothing new.
And who was this speech aimed at? Well,
he's got a real battle on his hands because global public opinion is up in the air at present. As you saw, as you just reported, there were jeers and cheers when he took to the stage. There were also a large number of diplomats who walked out of the General Assembly in New York. So there's a real battle for public opinion there. And you can tell from the type of language that he was using, the way that he spoke critically about the UN and referred to it as being an anti-Semitic cesspit, he was suggesting that, well, maybe we've got a real PR battle on our hands to win hearts and minds here to justify what is happening. But I guess what this also gets to is the broader struggle over the very nature of global politics and the possible future of a quote-unquote rules-based order.
There were thousands of people protesting today in New York ahead of Mr. Netanyahu's speech. Will he have won any of them over?
I highly doubt it. We've seen over the past 11 months or so that there is a very strong critical movement. There's a lot of anger directed at Mr. Netanyahu, both in Israel, in the wider Jewish community, in the diaspora, and around the world, at his handling of October 7, his handling in the war in Gaza, his handling of what's happening in Lebanon, and his broader politicking sort of within Israel itself. There have been huge protest movements across Tel Aviv, across Jerusalem, and now, of course, across New York. Allegations that he is responsible for committing war crimes, for committing genocide. And those sentiments will not have been swayed by a speech, granted a relatively powerful speech, but that will not have changed anyone's opinions here. The opinions that range from getting the hostages home to stopping the war in Gaza to preventing a wider escalation. This speech will not have changed any of those views.
Dr. Simon Mabon from Lancaster University in the UK, thank you so much.
Thank you.